I love to talk about how anyone can be a conductor and teacher because of all of the introverts out there who I really identify with. And I love to talk about that because I think it helps people know that anything's possible. And when we have the opportunity to step on the podium and conduct, I mean, we get to be a musician and get to be every emotion and convey the composer's intent and be the music. And I just love to talk about how exciting that is. And again, people stop themselves sometimes because they think I'm not the kind of person who can lead a group. I'm not the kind of person who can be a conductor because I'm quiet. Well, and not everybody wants to, of course, but I just love to speak about that.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Everything Band, a podcast that features conversations with composers, conductors, and performers of music for winds and percussion. My name is Mark Connor. I'm a composer and educator, and each week I have the good fortune to speak with and share the stories and wisdom of musicians and leaders in the band community. Are you planning to travel with your group sometime soon? If so, please consider my sponsor, Kaleidoscope Adventures, a full-service tour company specializing in student group travel. With a former educator as its CEO, Kaleidoscope Adventures is dedicated to changing student lives through travel, and they offer high-quality service and an attention to detail that comes from more than 25 years of student travel experience. Trust Kaleidoscope's outstanding staff to focus on your group's one-of-a-kind adventure so that you can focus on everything else. The Everything Band podcast is a proud member of the Music Teachers Development Podcast Network. The Muted Network provides support in the form of audio-on-demand programming designed by and for music educators. You can find more information about our network at mutedpodcasts.com. Before we begin, I'd like to thank Jake Walker and Colin Peters for their contributions to the show, and especially to all of you who are listening. I appreciate your time and hope that you are finding value from these interviews. I rely on word of mouth and social media to bring the show to new listeners. If you think you know one or two people who might find these interviews useful, please let them know about it. You can also help by following me and sharing posts on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. Remember, help your students live up to the best that is in them through music. And now on to my next guest, Karen Fannin. Hi, Karen.
Hi, Mark.
Thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
So, Karen, the first question I always ask is, can you introduce yourself for the audience? Tell them what you do and how you got there.
Sure. So I teach at the University of Nebraska at Omaha. So this is my 8th year there, and I serve as director of bands. I'm associate professor, and I also serve as one of the assistant directors of the School of Music. I love my job. I teach conducting. I teach some courses in music education and, of course, conduct the Symphonic Wind Ensemble and also teach graduate conducting.
Excellent. Karen, so we're going to talk a lot about your program a little bit later down the road, but I want to hear your origin story. How did you get started in music?
I started in music when I was in 2nd grade, and I asked my parents if I could take piano lessons. I had some friends at school who were taking lessons, and so I asked my parents, and we didn't have a piano, but they said yes, they bought a piano. And so I started taking lessons from my great aunt Helen, who just lived, I grew up on a farm in Iowa, and so she grew up kind of a mile down the road, and I started with her. And piano was kind of my first great love of music. I kind of progressed through teachers. I joined band when I was in 5th grade, and I play euphonium. I loved band. Music was just my home at school, and it was what I was good at, and I just loved both instruments. I will say that piano was kind of my first love all the way till I was a senior in high school. I was in band all the way through, but I kind of made a sudden shift in terms of what my major instrument was going to be. And it doesn't necessarily paint me in a great light, but I'll tell you anyway. I did some MTNA competitions, and I had won one on piano. But afterwards, I was disqualified because the piece I had played was in the wrong category. And for, an 18-year-old or 17-year-old, it was kind of devastating. And it just so happened, I had auditioned on both instruments at a few colleges. It just so happened the next day, the euphonium teacher from the University of Northern Iowa called and asked if, and offered me a scholarship. And I just accepted on the spot on the phone. And there I became a brass major. Now, I did love euphonium too, but it was sort of, it really was kind of the second choice all the way through. But I made that decision, and it's kind of interesting. Some of the decisions we make in life are kind of like that. And it was completely an instantaneous decision, which I think was a great one. I remember in high school going to Luther College music camp, and I went to piano camp there. And I had some high school friends who went and played in the band and were in the choir. And in piano camp, you're kind of by yourself all week, practicing in a practice room. And it's kind of interesting that it took me a while to kind of, I think I would have enjoyed being in those ensembles at camp as opposed to being in a practice room by myself. But, that's how I became a brass major. In terms of being a music education major, I think I came to it by just really wanting to play. I don't know that I necessarily thought I'm going to be a teacher. It was, I like to play. And if you're a euphonium player, there's not really a performance. There is a performance choice, but there's very, very, very few jobs. So you kind of get, directed in music education, which was great. That was a great fit for me. I did teach a few neighbor kids when I was in high school piano lessons. So I did have a little teaching experience there. And so that's kind of how I came into music education.
Well, I have a couple questions based on all of that. The first one, I'm going to kind of work my way backwards through my questions is, you mentioned how you came to be a euphonium major. One of my origin stories that everyone on the show knows is that when I was in third grade, the summer after third grade, I wanted to play the trombone, but my best friend wanted to play the trumpet. We ended up on trumpet. And I think that's like my original musical sin, because I think I'm much more set up to be a low brass player. So it's funny that you would say that. So I want to ask you a little bit more about that.
Mm-hmm.
That decision to disqualify you, I'm going to ask you a little bit later about competition.
Mm-hmm.
And, I teach now the youngest kids. I teach 5th through 8th grade. And I'm very aware of like their formative experiences and trying to make everything positive. And I'm curious about, in retrospect, what you think of that decision. And we don't have to name names or, be too critical, but.
Well, it's so interesting. I think I didn't do those until, the last few years of high school. And I remember when this happened, I remember the teacher coming up to me and saying, "Can I look at your piece?" And then I remember that's seeing then this person go, I remember kind of seeing how it unfolded, how it was kind of an honest question. "May I see your piece? Good job." And then it turned into this person reporting. And, my piece was in a harder category than I had, so it was really sort of
unnecessary.
And I had played well, and I wish I could say, wow, I played well. I should feel good about that, because I really, if I could speak to my younger self, I would say, well, did it really matter? It really didn't, but it sure did at the time. And it was, it's very fascinating.
Yeah, it speaks to sometimes I think when we're not looking at the musician and we're more concerned about the rules.
Yes.
They weren't looking at you, the person.
Right.
And that's alarming to me, because that's what we're doing this for, presumably, is to build up people.
Yes.
And so anyway, so I just, that really resonates with me as far as like my philosophies and what comes through on the show. I think most of the listeners would agree.
Yes.
All right. So I want to back up all the way then. So you mentioned that the piano is your first love. And, we all remember like that excitement about music, whatever it is where we start. And so do you remember like, what was it about the piano? Do you remember playing something? Do you remember something that happened that made you like really sort of like grab on a music?
It was when I had an opportunity very young, probably in middle school, to start accompanying for people, collaborating. I was the pianist for the show choir when I was an eighth grader.
Oh, wow. So you were pretty good.
Yes. And I also grew up in a small town of 3,000 that's about 2.5 hours from Minneapolis and 2.5 hours from Des Moines. So, I was a bit of a maybe big fish in a small pond. I was, yes, I had that opportunity. And I think that if I look back at what I loved, it were the experiences where I got to make music with other people, as opposed to being a soloist. I will say the thing that I did struggle with was memory, and having a few experiences that were, fairly devastating if you have a memory slip. That is not fun as a pianist. And so I think, my experience as a piano player in a very small place is different from some of the things that you see in a larger city of experiences. And so I think that it was great experiences. But again, the collaborating is, I think, is what I really liked about piano. And then, of course, playing euphonium, you're collaborating all the time, but you have more of a leadership role when you're the pianist in those situations, because it's just you with one other person or you with a few others. And it's different than being one of 50 or one of 60 in a band.
Oh, absolutely. And that never really goes away.
Right.
All right. So we talked about euphonium in the 5th grade. You started on euphonium. You didn't start on trumpet and get moved.
No. And I'll tell you how I started on euphonium. In our school, I remember we took a test where you get a score. And then I remember that our teachers brought us down and they kind of tested the people with the highest score for certain instruments, which was percussion. So that was not me. I was brought in a group, or the instrument that they targeted for me to try was the horn. But I had braces when I tried these instruments. So that did not work. So then they had me try trombone and euphonium. And I chose the euphonium. Now, I don't know if it's because it was a school instrument. I remember that being a perk because my parents didn't have to buy an instrument. But that's again, kind of how I picked it. So it wasn't, again, because I loved it or I loved the sound or chose it from a wide array. That was just a system. It was very targeted on who they kind of wanted to put on instruments. And so I don't remember really trying any woodwind instruments, except for when I did get tired of carrying my euphonium to school and asked in 5th grade if I could try the flute. So she sent one home with me and I couldn't get it to play.
Yep.
I always wonder if that was a trick.
All right. So you mentioned University of Northern Iowa.
Yes.
You want to tell me about that experience?
Oh, I love my time at Northern Iowa. I was a euphonium major, and I had a wonderful teacher. His name is Dr. Jeffrey Funderburk, who's now the director of the School of Music there. And one of the great experiences that I had there was playing in the tuba euphonium ensemble. So there were 10 to 12 of us, maybe more. And what an awesome opportunity to play that chamber music. I also took piano lessons and I accompanied a lot of people. And that was a big part of my time there, which was not part of my degree plan, but I played for all kinds of juries and played for voice lessons and loved that. And one interesting thing about my playing that really kind of defined the beginning of it for me is this was about week 3 of my lesson. And Dr. Funderburk said, "Are you using your tongue to tongue?" And so he said, and we discovered that I was faking it with my air. And I had played pieces like the Bluebells of Scotland by Arthur Pryor, but faked it with my air. I hadn't had official private lessons, until I went to UNI. we had real short lessons in our school, but I think I just faked it so well because, again, I played an audition for him. It was a couple weeks into school. And so we discovered that I really hadn't used my tongue to tongue. And so I had to start over. I had to take the Arbenz book and play quarter notes because of any relearning of a skill. There's no shortcut. You have to go back all the way. And so what this meant for me was that some of my friends were auditioning and getting placed in the top wind ensemble. And that didn't happen for me till later in my college career because I had to go back and learn this skill. So other wonderful experiences that I had at Northern Iowa was working with, a few conductors. One is Ron Johnson. He just passed away a few months ago. He was a wonderful conductor. I had him for wind literature in conducting class. And Dr. John Valentine was the marching band director and taught some other courses in music education. And they were really wonderful too. And I'll say that in terms of thinking about competition, we talked so much about the philosophy of competing and where that place was in music programs, so much so that I really came out with a vision that I'm going to have a program where competition is not part of it. And it was we had so many great philosophical, discussions in those classes.
It is one of the great questions of our profession.
Yes.
Because there are really compelling reasons on both sides.
Yes.
And so that's the problem, or that's the joy of it, or whatever we want to call it.
Yes.
All right. So now I need to dig into this because when I was a college freshman, because I was playing the trumpet, which I shouldn't have been playing, I should have been playing the trombone. My trumpet teacher had me go through an embouchure change, and I was starting over much like you were. And I remember being enormously frustrated, stuck on the third parts and, not being able to play. I'm trying to get through a degree while I'm in the middle of an embouchure change, playing the ensembles. And I want to ask you about that experience and dealing with that frustration, because I know there had to be a good deal of it.
Yes, there was a good deal of it. I'm a really hard worker. I think a lot of that comes from growing up on a farm, and the perseverance that it takes, because when you have animals to feed, they have to be fed all the time. And so all of those things. So I dug right in. There was I never doubted, I never considered quitting or dropping or doing anything. As we're talking, I wonder how much, honestly, having the piano experience at the same time helped me, because that was a way where I was able to stand out and be a leader in that area. And there were really very fine euphonium players ahead of me. So part of it is just, you kind of had to wait your turn too until a few people graduated who were fine players, to kind of have those opportunities. But it was very frustrating. And I think things such as performing in the Friday music seminar, I didn't do for a while. And then I think when I finally did, it felt like, wow, I'm putting this whole skill is out for everybody to.
Yeah. I don't think I ever really recovered from mine, but I'm still scarred emotionally. But what I really love about what you said is that you had the piano. So you had a way of sort of demonstrating your value as a musician.
Yes.
And I think sometimes, that is a theme with maybe players at the bottom of our ensembles, or players, when you get to college and suddenly you go from being the big fish in a small pond to being the tiny fish in a big pond. And,
yes.
and, that sense of like perseverance that you mentioned, or hard work, or whatever it is, or just not giving up. Like I was going to get my music degree. There was no one that was going to tell me I couldn't do it.
Yes.
But it left some scars along the way. And I always think about that and like, what can we do? And I don't know if I have a question here, but maybe what sort of advice would we have for dealing with those students who maybe you can see the frustration, whether it's at middle school, high school, college. I don't know if that makes sense, but.
Yes. I think making sure people are enjoying music making, and the enjoyment has to be there, and finding leadership opportunities and ways to make sure that people feel valued. One thing I like to say to groups is just stressing that everyone is a leader. We're all going to be better if people are leading from third part, if those are the people who are leading, rather than following the first chair person. That can really elevate people. The other line I say a lot to low brass is they can sound great by themselves. They also have the great power to elevate the whole group, which is really helpful for younger players whose parts are they're sitting on whole notes and half notes, and for them to know how important they are to everyone.
All right. So you were a music education major?
Yes.
All right. So let's talk about that piece.
Okay.
You did the degree, student taught right away?
I student taught in the fall of my senior year, and their UNI has a really large education department. So you either would student teach in the fall or spring. And if you went and student taught in the fall, you would come back and finish in the spring. So I had an unusual experience in that I student taught in the fall, and I chose to do that so I could work with marching band and have that experience. And then I returned to UNI in the spring and took double reed techniques. I hadn't taken that. Maybe there was an education class I had left, some electives like instrument repair. And so that was when I look at the students I have at my school and imagining that scenario, it's very hard to imagine that, because student teaching is such a formative, big experience that to then return and finish, that was just very common at this school.
All right. So you student taught. Now, did you get a job right away?
I did. Let's see. I was hired in March before I graduated. And I was hired to teach at Lynnville-Sully Public Schools. And Lynnville-Sully is a town that's about 50 miles east of Des Moines, Iowa. And so the job was teaching 6 through 12 band. And, small town, maybe the second smallest classification of schools in Iowa. And so I was hired to teach 6th grade band, 6th grade beginners, 7th and 8th grade band, and then high school band. And I was there for 3 years.
And so how many days a week did you have each group?
I had 6th grade and high school every day, and then 7th and 8th grade every other day. And what's really wonderful about the program that I taught in, and also the program in Iowa where I grew up, is that, and I'm not sure to the degree that this exists everywhere there, but there would be summer lessons and also lessons during the school day, pull-out lessons, even at the high school level, very short, but some one-on-one time. And so at Lynnville-Sully, I began teaching in June, right after graduation, teaching the summer program. And so I started all of the 6th graders. It was a 6-week program, and started them in groups of 2 or 3 on like instruments. And they'd come in once a week. And so by the time we started in August, we could play, we were ready to go and play out of the method book, and then I was still able to see them once every 6-day cycle for about 15 to 20 minutes, and still give them that private instruction or small group instruction. And same thing with the high school students and middle school. I had that chance to see them. So that was, and some of that was teaching before and after school, but that was kind of inherent to, again, the program I grew up in this program, and the program I student taught in as well.
What was the progression then for you to move into sort of go back to graduate school to aspire to be a college band director?
Well, I'll tell you about my first experience conducting a group, which was what made me just really love it. I had an opportunity, I think, when I was a sophomore at UNI to conduct, it was called like tech band, I think is what we called it. It was a group on Fridays of everybody on their secondary instruments. And so different students would teach the class, conduct the class. And I remember having that opportunity early for some reason. They needed somebody to do it. And I am somebody who has always been or was pretty quiet, pretty introverted. And so for me to get up and do that was not, it was surprising that it was so wonderful. I was always the person whose face turned red if somebody asked me something and I was embarrassed. That's me, very quiet. And playing my euphonium is great because you've got this instrument to hold, and
it's big, and so kind of like covers you up a little bit.
Yeah, exactly. And this is what I love to share with my students, because anybody can be a conductor and teacher. Your personality off the podium is sometimes different than your, public extrovert face. But anyway, that was where I discovered that was my first kind of real conducting experience that I just really loved. And so then skipping ahead a little bit, after my first year teaching, I remember seeing my middle school band director, who had moved to the high school. And he had told me that he had attended this conducting workshop at the University of Minnesota the summer before, and how awesome it was. And he described it, and I thought, I want to go do that. So I looked it up, and I signed up and went to the University of Minnesota conducting workshop after my first year of teaching. And that was the first time that I had learned that you could get a graduate degree in conducting.
Mm-hmm. Interesting that you didn't know that at UNI.
Well, I know. I tell you, I'm a first generation college student, and I think that once you see the finish line of graduating college and having a job, and I don't know that I had thoughts past that at that time. I remember my euphonium teacher mentioning it to me in one lesson, that there's you should know that graduate school is an option for you. And he wasn't talking about after finishing, but he put that seed in my brain. But it was very abstract because I didn't know people who had gone to graduate school. I mean, I guess I did, but I didn't. It was just sort of not part of what I was thinking about. But attending that workshop was where, being around the people I met and being there for that week, I learned that, wow, it is possible to go back to school and study conducting. Because that was the first time that I had a chance to conduct a group at a symposium and receive feedback on my conducting. And that was the format at the time was pretty large. So there were a lot of people. And so you conducted once throughout the week. And so then the following summer, I went to another one, this one closer to where I lived at Central College in Iowa, and Paula Holcomb was teaching there, and she brought Craig Kirchhoff as her guest, who was the person I worked with at the University of Minnesota.
I was going to ask you that.
Yeah. And so I went to that one. That was a smaller, more intimate local one. And it was at that point that I decided, as I was entering my third year, that I would like to apply to programs and go full time. And so I asked my college band director, Ron Johnson, where are some places that you think I should apply? And he recommended a few. And so I applied, and I was fortunate enough to be invited to audition at Northwestern. I had heard Mallory Thompson speak at the University of Minnesota symposium, and which was really wonderful. And so I auditioned, was accepted, and decided to go to Northwestern, and loved my 2 years there for sure.
Yeah, no doubt. It's a terrific conducting program, as you know. So you were only taught then for 2 years?
I taught for 3 years. So it was during the third year that I made videos and made plans.
So let me ask you, sometimes you see on job listings X number of years of public school teaching.
Mm-hmm.
If there is someone out there who is a high school or middle school band director listening to this who's thinking about going to graduate school for conducting,
Mm-hmm.
would you recommend they teach for a few more years? Like, how long would you have them teach? And then would you have them do conducting masters and education masters? And then, I mean, like, how would you plan it out if you could plan someone's career out?
Yes. Well, I think 3 to 5 years is sort of what you see in just job descriptions, sometimes with what people want. I think 3 to 5 is good because it gives you enough time to be settled into a program. 3 maybe is the bare minimum to feel like you've done something in a program. And so I think that that's good. It sure helps to have that teaching experience before going to a graduate program, because you get all that experience just on the job, and you can't really you can't substitute that experience.
No, it's like being a parent, right?
Right.
You could read all the books in the world, but until you have children, you don't know.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. And so, one of the questions I often get asked, I just sort of get these random questions from people who listen to the show. Like, would you get a master's in education or a master's in conducting, or would you get how would you do it? Because if you have 2 degrees, a master's and a doctorate, would you want one in education and one in conducting, or both in conducting? I mean, where do you come down on that sort of thing? Because I know you can kind of do both and still end up with a job.
Yes, absolutely. With a master in music education, there's more opportunities to do research. And of course, with a doctorate or a PhD, the same way. So it depends on what people want out of their experience. If it's more music making, then conducting is all music making. If you want some of the research experience, then the education degree makes a lot of sense. I think for people who have one of each, what a wonderful skill set to be able to understand statistics and be able to understand some of those things. I don't have that experience because both of my graduate degrees are in conducting. And every now and again, I'll find myself in a situation where people are talking about statistics and that language. And that is not anything that I've had experience in. And it would be, and of course, there's articles that use all of that information that you learn in a PhD. And but again, there's always a trade-off. So I think it just depends on what one wants.
All right. So 2 years at Northwestern.
Yes.
What happened next?
Then I applied for high school jobs. I remember talking with Dr. Thompson about next steps, and 3 years at that point, for me, especially being in kind of small town Iowa, was perhaps not enough to go on to a doctorate right away.
Sure.
So having a different experience is something that I went after. And so I applied for high school jobs and ended up, and I looked kind of several areas of the country, but ended up getting one in the Chicago area at Lockport Township High School.
Okay.
Yes. And that was a very different experience from my first job. This was a high school of 3,000. So very large school, great history of music making, and really a wonderful position. So I conducted the Wind Symphony, and then I had a colleague who conducted the symphonic band, and we had a third band, concert band, freshman band. The freshmen were separated, which was really wonderful to have freshmen by themselves. That's a really helpful thing for them to be in a community with each other. We had a voluntary marching band, and really supportive music booster organization. Private teachers who came to the schools that students could hire to teach. one of the interesting things that I instituted there and did in that short time that I was there was have a composer in residence program. And I wasn't there long. I decided to go get a doctorate, which is why I left there. But we had a trumpet teacher who was also a composer. And so he would write things for the different bands and we'd play them and he'd speak with them. And then what's kind of neat is he had a student also interested in composing who was in the high school band. So he was my student, he was a trumpet student, and he was really interested in composing. And he wrote a piece for our band. And so that's one thing that I remember doing there that I think was really enriching for the students. And it was very neat to have a composer who the students saw more than once. It was somebody who was around.
One of the things that I really try to champion is the idea of, we want to show kids that it's possible to be a composer. Because every time that I've worked in a commission with a school and you zoom in, and if they haven't had any experience with a composer before, it's always like, how did you do this? What did you think of doing this? And it was like, well, I was in college and someone said, you might be good at this. And I did it. I really urge teachers to do something with composers, have them zoom in. You're playing music by people who are breathing and living. Just most will do it for a small fee or free in many cases. So just ask. Okay, so Lockport Township, and then you went and got your doctorate. And so we should probably talk about that and then get into what you're doing at Nebraska, Omaha.
Sure. Yes. So a teacher that I had worked with at various conducting symposia was Alan McMurray. And so he was somebody that I really worked well with, and it was just always so fun. And so I applied to the University of Colorado. And I was going to teach for 3 years, but there was a spot that opened up. He had said, if you think you're interested, apply before you think you're going to come, because, he spots for those studios sometimes fill. You sometimes have to wait a couple of years. So I had applied earlier than I thought I was going to go because he had advised me to do so. But then he called in the spring of my second year and said, I know you put fall of X down, but would you consider coming a year early because we have a spot, so I auditioned then earlier than I had kind of put on my application. And went to Colorado to study with him. My motivation for the doctorate was to study conducting more. It's kind of interesting when we think about paths because, of course, the college job market is tricky because once you apply for a college job, you have to look everywhere. You have to spread your wings very wide to find a job. And I tell you, I didn't think about that. I just knew I wanted to study conducting. And in retrospect, it worked out. I'm glad I didn't kind of stop myself before I started, because I think you can overthink that. But the other side of it is you need to be a realist too. And, luckily my husband was so supportive in kind of, me having these opportunities, and he was willing to shift what he was doing to accommodate that. And so that's really wonderful too. But I love my time at Colorado. With my assistantship, had a chance to work with all of the bands and the marching band and the pep band. And so then I was really set up well to, I think, apply for college teaching jobs at that time. One thing that he did require his students to do was keep up with their playing, which was really great. Every graduate student had to audition for ensembles, even if maybe they weren't placed. But so I was placed in a group and played euphonium as a doctoral student, even though it wasn't required. But see, then when there was the job that I ended up getting right after Colorado, was teaching, part of it was teaching low brass, but I'd kept up with my playing. So that was a really kind of smart thing, I think, that he had students do.
All right. So you mentioned your first job, you had to teach low brass. So this isn't your first job.
No. After I finished my doctorate, I was hired at Hendrix College in Conway, Arkansas. So then this job possibility came open, and I'm from Iowa, and so the location was attractive, and so ended up here.
Okay. And so now you're at the University of Nebraska, Omaha, and you and I have had a previous conversation. So what you mentioned that you teach conducting, that's your favorite thing to do. What other things, I know you mentioned it earlier, but it's been a long conversation. What other things do you do in your job?
Well, I conduct the Symphonic Wind Ensemble, which is a group of mostly music majors and some non-majors. I teach advanced conducting, which I love. The goal is for them to feel like when they finish the class, they can kind of tackle anything. And so we're doing parts of Lincolnshire Posy right now in that class. And there's an excerpt from The Soldier's Tale that is the final thing that we do. I teach a few days in our music education core classes. And so our rehearsal techniques class is embedded in those. And so I have a chance to work with music education majors as they're in their practicum, and we have a series of pieces, and they conduct each other and rehearse, and I give them feedback. And then I also teach a day in the spring where it's kind of the methods and materials, organizational administration, getting people ready to go out and be instrumental music teachers. And I love working with music education majors. That was one of the reasons too why I was looking to leave Hendrix, because Hendrix doesn't have a music education program. They only have a Bachelor of Arts. And I really wanted to have, work with music education students. And so that's one of my real joys, is having that opportunity at Nebraska, Omaha.
Yeah, that would be the only thing that would get me back teaching theory, is if I had an opportunity to teach somewhere where I could also work with music ed or conduct or something, because I don't really ever want to go back to teaching college music theory. I kind of it's like eating too many Rice Krispie treats. They don't taste so good after a while. Right. So I'm curious about the advanced conducting. So they must have a basic conducting. Who teaches that at your school?
My colleague, Dr. Joshua Kearney. Yeah, so he teaches those courses, and then they come to me for this course. And he's a really fine teacher, so we have a really great thing going, I think, with these students.
How many instrumental ensembles do you have there?
We have 2 concert bands. So my colleague conducts the university band. And then we have a marching band, which is interesting because we don't have a football team. So we have a marching band that plays for a lot of university events, and occasionally, actually every year, plays for a few soccer games. And then the big performances are playing in exhibition at marching band festivals. And so it's a great opportunity for people to hear about our school and, through these marching band performances.
That's really interesting.
Yeah. Yeah.
So Karen, at least in the course of my career, and I asked this question, you don't have to answer it if you don't want to, but, when I was young, I had no women who were band directors. And in fact, I've never been in a band where the principal conductor was a woman in my entire life. And I don't know how I know because I'm of a certain age, but I'm curious about that, because I always ask this question, and it's like, what sort of challenges did you face? And what would you say to a young woman who wants to go on and get a doctorate and become a college conductor?
Well, I think being a euphonium player, mm-hmm. I was usually the only female in that world. And so I found a very welcoming world at the University of Northern Iowa, being the only female low brass player, especially in this tuba euphonium ensemble. In fact, just a funny story. I have a friend from that time who calls me the thorn among the roses. Still to this day.
Uh-huh.
And so I am fortunate to have had some great experiences like that, at my school. I will say that I was fortunate to have some female role models throughout, kind of scattered throughout. Going back to the first, which was when I student taught, the assistant band director at the high school where I student taught was a female.
Oh, okay.
Her name is Jane Triplett, and she teaches in Iowa City now. And, she was wonderful. She was not my main supervising teacher, but what a wonderful mentor and person that I had a chance to work with. And then going back to when I was even teaching my first few years, I mentioned this earlier to you, Paula Holcomb at Central College, where I went to that conducting workshop after my second year of teaching. And this is in the 1990s, when these, speaking of Paula Holcomb, she was a real role model in Iowa. For instance, Jane Triplett, who I student taught with, I think that was someone who was a role model for her, where there weren't any females, and there was, Paula Holcomb. And then, of course, having the opportunity to work with Mallory Thompson, and then other mentors were men. And I will say, here and there have been, maybe I do have a story that I like to tell sometimes about the challenges of things that sometimes happen that have happened when you're a female. I'll speak in general terms about the situation. I was at an interview, and it was a kind of interview where there were, it wasn't necessarily it was an interview. And I had a good interview, and I came out, and the next person who was scheduled to interview was there. And there were people who were involved in the interview process who introduced me to this other person who was interviewing. And this was somebody who had been around a long time. I hadn't. I was kind of new to the area. And in front of the people who were running the interview, this person, when introduced to me, said, "Well, my, aren't you young and pretty?" And I said, "Well, thank you. That's a nice compliment." And I tell you, I share this because I think it's a complex issue. I think it's complex because this person should not have said this to me, especially in an interview. I had this said to me when there were other people around who were decision makers on who was going to get this opportunity. And so if I would have called this person out on something he shouldn't have said, I tell you, I wouldn't have looked good. And I don't think I would have had the opportunity. I did get the opportunity, and the other person did not. But someone said to me once, sometimes people will say things that they might not know what they're saying or something. And so I do like to pose the question to my students. I'll tell them this story. What's the thing to do here?
Mm-hmm, sure.
And it's because you don't want to shame someone. And so I believe I did the right thing, and it worked out in my favor. But the person also said something they shouldn't have, and that's not a good thing. And so hopefully there are people, the people in power in that situation were the people running the interview. And so, hopefully those are the people who can, in that situation, those are the people who.
Yeah, you weren't in a position to say something at that point.
No, exactly. Right. And who knows if that played into the decision of the job? It could have very well, but it may not have.
It may have.
I don't know.
How about advice you would give to young women who are thinking about a career in college conducting or professional conducting? Who knows? Maybe,
Well, to go for it, to study hard, to work hard, to be bold, and go for it. I think one thing that I work with all students on is presence and, how we present ourselves and confidence. And there's a really interesting TED Talk by Amy Cuddy where she talks about power poses. And I like to share that with my students. And I think for everyone, but perhaps we could say, well, I'll say it's for everyone, but I think just in terms of females being smaller and maybe the life experiences that females often bring to the profession of, how just they were raised in regular life and such, sometimes having those tools to really improve on presence and, building confidence is something that is really, really helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting when you think about that because you have to kind of craft the image for yourself, the presentation for yourself that works for you. Some people need to be bigger than life. Some people need to be smaller than life.
Well,
it
yes.
just depends on, what you are. And there's no one size fits all, but I do think it has to be authentic.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that's another thing I remember when I was a first year teacher and young teacher, I approached it, I was going to be really businesslike because I had to compensate for, and so that's how I approached things my first years of teaching. But what that got in the way with was helping to make authentic connections with people. And that would be, if I could go back, I would do a better job of that. Because I think that's something that it would have been helpful to talk about in college. It just never, ever came up. So I tend to talk about this a lot with my students. That authenticity is so important. I know just in terms of, it worked well in terms of running a program. And I think, running a program, I'll just leave it at that. But the way it made things hard on me because it meant that my enjoyment of things was not as it could have been, because those important connections you have with people are just not authentic if you have this wall and are about, here's what we're going to do and really businesslike.
Yeah, there's a lot to the craft of teaching that isn't taught in college. It's really interesting. You think about like what we focus on in education programs is mostly like how to do assessments, how to, do the basics of the research, how to teach the methods, like the methods courses. This is what you do when the trumpet does this. But we don't spend enough time talking about like building relationships with the students, building relationships with your colleagues, fitting into a school community, all those things that have more to do with success than actually whether you know the fingerings for a B flat on the saxophone.
Yes.
Because you can teach yourself the fingerings on a saxophone.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
But those personal relationships, that's why people get and lose jobs.
Yes, absolutely.
And I've never, and knock on wood, there's people who've been really royally put in bad spots, but for the most part, when I've seen teachers depart, there usually was something that was more than their skill as a teacher.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
I guess the natural question then to ask is, what do you think we could do better then for these music education students? Because you mentioned some of the things you're doing.
Well, I'm fortunate to see so many wonderful people who I have as students that I'm just really excited about what they'll, go out and do. And they're very excited. I think, wow, there's such an awareness on mental health. And I've noticed that coming up a lot in our just questions in our class. And I've even been more aware as I work with the students in my ensemble. Last year, I really was into these wellness tips that I sent the students. Last year, we had to rehearse 10 feet apart because of spacing, which meant that I couldn't see all of them at once. We could have a chamber group as large as 18 at any one time. So it was this big puzzle piece of pieces. And so I didn't have an opportunity last year to see all of them at once in the ensemble, and so what I did was I would occasionally send these wellness tips out. I'm really interested in wellness just in my own reading and life balance and things. And so I would send them little ideas. And my students really liked getting those messages. And I think that what that does for music education students is then that gives them a model of, well, they can do whatever is age appropriate for their students, to be thinking about, wellness, breathing tips. I think some of these things might be inherent to what kids are getting in schools in other areas. But I think in the music room, we can bring these things to everyone. Things like eating well, exercising, little tips on specifics with those things.
Yeah, no question.
Hi, everyone. My name is Lisa Tatum, and I'm the host of Ictus, the Evolving Conductor, a proud member of the Muted Podcast Network. Ictus is your source for any and everything conducting, listening, teaching, and music making. Treat yourself to a dose of musical inspiration as we pick the minds of great conductors and delve into noteworthy repertoire. If you're a musician, teacher, or conductor, you found your people. New episodes are released on Thursdays, and you can find Ictus anywhere you listen to podcasts or ictuspodcast.com. That's IC2US podcast.com.
Where do you draw the line between healthy and unhealthy competition in music?
I think it depends on what is a motivating factor. If it's intrinsic motivation, then that, and there's a competitive scenario, that seems to be beneficial in some way. If it's about winning a trophy or something external that you're going to forget about after you kind of get the prize, that's problematic. I think if it limits risk taking in music making, then it's a problem. If the rehearsals become about what can we do to get a 1, and we don't want to go for it on that phrase because somebody might chip that high note and the judge might think poorly. When that limits the music making, that's a problem. If it's just kind of a cherry on top to making music intrinsically and being in it for camaraderie and learning and improving, then it's fine. But if it drives the process, then I think that's a problem.
How do you achieve a work-life balance?
Oh, I think it's hard. It takes a lot of juggling. And I think sometimes you're not always in balance with yourself. I have to say, I think about it in terms of, I'm a precrastinator. Adam Grant has used that word in some of his writings. So I front load logistics and things that are just helpful to have peace of mind that they're done, to give myself space and to make time for, more of the life things. That's kind of how I honestly think about it, which I question if that is, quote unquote, the right way to think about it. But if I'm honest, that's how I think about it, because that helps give me peace of mind that I've kind of taken care of that work part. And of course, things come up, so it's not always. But just making time for things that are going to recharge me. In terms of music, the thing I always prioritize is studying my scores, because that's going to keep me excited. It's the first thing I do when I go to work. I had rehearsal today, so I was at school at 8 and I studied my scores, and so that I could have peace of mind that I'd done the most important thing for the day for me as a musician, and then I could do the things that were non-musical that I had to do.
I was just going to say, it's so funny because I only teach 2 days a week in my current job. So the last thing I do every day is study the scores for the next rehearsal so that I can then, because I can go in and just teach.
Yes.
I make my notes. Okay, we're going to do this. We're going to do this. We're going to do this. And then I'm good. I'm like done.
Yes.
Because I won't do it in the morning. I know I'll just do other things.
I don't have rehearsal till 1:30. And so that's why if it was in the morning, that would be,
Yeah. I just can't leave work without knowing.
Exactly.
Because then I can write like what we're going to rehearse on the board for the next rehearsal before I leave.
Yes. So. And I also, one other thing I will, that I'll tell my students about is the how you feel really bad if you haven't done that preparation and you have a rehearsal to do. If you haven't done, it's about being prepared for your students, but there is part of it that goes into just feeling good as a musician that you've done what you want to do.
All right. So this is the big question, Karen. There's no good answer, of course, but what are the challenges facing music education and band, and how do we best meet them?
Well, I can think of a few. Mental health, for sure. I think, dealing with those challenges in the classroom. One thing when we talk about this, when I talk about this with students, we're not mental health professionals. I say we can be kind and we can, again, make everyone feel welcome and make everyone feel heard, and that people are important. Those are kind of big picture things that aren't necessarily musical, but I feel like we can do within the music environment that are really important. I think about them with my own students in rehearsal. What kind of environment is this going to be for them that's going to not only want them to come back, but also just feed their soul? What are we going to do that's able to feed their soul? What joy, are we getting from these rehearsals? And so I think that's something that we need in the schools, is people to bring that joy and connection. I think kind of to shift to something really different is instrumentation as a challenge in some areas. I think there are instruments that aren't always started in because of marching band. They're not instruments that fit with the marching band, and therefore they're not started. So I think that challenges. I'll speak with the Omaha Public Schools. I'll just mention something I know they do. They have a wonderful program to bring teachers to the schools to that's funded, where I don't know all the details to speak about all of the details, of course, but for some of the high need instruments, double reeds and things, to help get people going on them and give them the support of lessons, which you need on some of those difficult instruments.
Yes, you do. I won't let a student start one without private lessons of some kind, because I'm not equipped. I could start a student on an oboe or a bassoon, but I'm honestly, I've taught so few over my career. I could brush up, but it's better if they have more support than what I can give them.
Yes.
So which brings me, you and I met back in February, and you told me that your daughter is a young oboe player. How's that going for her?
It's going great. She has a wonderful teacher. And so thus, to your point, she started the oboe. Her band director is an oboist.
Okay.
But she did start with she's never had a teacher who isn't an oboe player conductor, which is, interesting and maybe a strange situation, but it's going well because she had that support. The method book starts with a D on the oboe, which is a very difficult note. Mm-hmm, and so It was almost the first hurdle that she had to clear, and right after starting. And once she kind of cleared and got that difficult note out, then the other things comparatively in terms of learning new notes were easier.
Yeah, no, the oboe starts on a bad note. Horns start on a bad note. Mm-hmm. Flutes start on a bad note.
Yes. I could see how somebody could just not ever get past the first note.
There's a lot of problems with method books, but we also acknowledge that they're trying to hit some kind of middle that doesn't exist.
And then another challenge I would say is scheduling. There's a lot of I think schools that are using block schedules. That's challenging in terms of having a 90-minute block of time to play and to keep people occupied, which means you have to have multiple activities. And I think that's very challenging.
All right. So the next question I always ask is my favorite of the entire interview. If I had a time machine and I could take you back to the afternoon of your high school graduation, what would you tell yourself?
Oh, wow. What a question. I think, go for it, try things. I think risk taking. I remember getting that advice. I had Alan McMurray, he had this saying, which I loved: leap and the net will appear. Yeah. Leap and the net will appear. Okay. I think that I would share the 4 agreements with myself. That's what I would do. I don't know if you've encountered that book called The 4 Agreements.
I may have, but can you kind of paraphrase for us?
Yes. There are 4 tenets that the author talks about. Always do your best. Don't make assumptions. Don't take anything personally, and be impeccable with your word. And I love those 4 because they are just so pervasive. Especially don't take things personally and don't make assumptions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no question.
And I think those are things that, wow, if you thought about those in high school before you kind of embarked on life, wow, would that save you some grief?
If you could plan it out, what would be the last piece of music you would perform or hear in your life if you had that control?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it would be David Maslanka's Symphony No. 4. I love that piece. I have conducted it once. But I just think it's just transcending. And I love, it uses the doxology, Old 100. And, I grew up a Lutheran. And so that's kind of a part of just something I grew up hearing. And of course it's based partly on that. And I just love the power of that piece and the journeys it takes you on and the emotions and the powerful ending. And it's just terrific.
Yeah, it's a special piece for sure. All right, Karen, is there anything coming up that you'd like to share or promote?
Sure. Well, in a few weeks, we have a wind ensemble concert, and we're doing 2 consortium premieres. One is a piece by Alexandra Gardner, which is called Just Say Yes. It's a drum set concerto. So she originally wrote it for the drummer from, Yes, and the Seattle Symphony. And it's a wonderful piece. And so we're doing that with my colleague, Tom Rowland, on our concert. And then the other consortium premiere we're doing is a piece that the commission was led by Courtney Snyder at the University of Michigan, but it's 13 college female band directors who contributed to commission Valerie Coleman. And the piece is Let Woman Choose Her Sphere. And it's a 20-minute work, and it's wonderful. We are just loving working on it. The title is a play on words from a song from the that's an old song called it's another play on words with sphere. Keep woman in her sphere. That's what it is. Instead of let woman choose her sphere. And so we have that concert coming up, and then I'm really excited as I begin a term as the president-elect of the Nebraska State Bandmasters Association. So that term started in March. And so this year is a year to kind of get onboarded, but I'm excited to join the board and help plan the conference. And there's also a young directors boot camp that NSBA puts on. And so I'll be part of putting that together. And it's great to have that impact on people in our whole state and work with all the directors in our state.
Karen, thank you so much for your time. I hope you had a good time.
Oh, I had a great time. This was a lot of fun.